The fallout from Britain's shock election result has shifted attention away from what has otherwise been the biggest preoccupation in the UK: how to combat violent extremism. Theresa May's manifesto included a commitment to double down on efforts to fight terrorism after 3 attacks in quick succession. But one of the UK's most prominent counter-extremism groups, Quilliam, is calling for the government to prioritise the appointment of a powerful national coordinator to set policy across all departments. The founder of Quilliam is Maajid Nawaz, who was once a radical Islamist with the group Hizb ut-Tahrir. He ran in the 2015 election for the Liberal Democrats. Now Maajid Nawaz hosts a talkback radio program where he's often heard urging the Muslim community to galvanise against Islamist ideology so that jihadists stand isolated. He joined me earlier from London. Maajid Nawaz, good to have you back on the show.
Pleasure.
Now, the ringleader of the London Bridge attack, the Pakistan-born British citizen Quilliam, your organisation Quilliam had previously reported him to police and counter-extremist officials. What more could have been done to have prevented his crimes?
Yes, that's right. Quilliam attacked one of my senior staff, Dr. Usama Hassan, in fact, it was in a family event. It was an Eid gathering last year, and he identified that Dr. Usama Hassan worked for Quilliam and began shouting apostate at the top of his voice at Dr. Hassan, and then proceeded to lunge at him and physically attack him. He was eventually wrestled to the ground by passers-by, and we, as an organisation, reported Quilliam to the police as an extremist and said this man needs to be kept an eye on. The problem, of course, is that, as the security services later explained to the nation, they have the capacity to monitor 3,000 terrorist suspects in any one time, and they're at full capacity. And then they told us that not only are they actively monitoring 3,000, which is their maximum capacity, but there are 20,000 extra that they wish they could monitor, that need to be monitored, that they simply cannot keep up with because 3,000 is their maximum range. And so you've got 23,000 suspected jihadists who are, according to our own security services, this is not the tabloid newspapers saying this, who are running around the United Kingdom.
You've come up with a 4-point plan to defeat Islamist extremism in Britain. Can you please outline that plan for us and tell us how it squares with Theresa May's enough is enough announcement of last week?
Yes, well, I think the first thing I said was that it was in contrast, in fact, to Theresa May's own 4-point plan. The first thing I said was that we have to identify, name and shame the Islamist ideology. And what I mean by Islamism, in a brief one-sentence definition, is the desire to impose any version of Islam over society, as distinct from the religion of Islam. And by naming and shaming this ideology, the Islamist ideology, it helps us to isolate it from Muslim communities. The figures I just spoke about, in terms of the numbers, the sheer numbers of terrorists that need to be monitored in this country, 23,000 from a population of only 4 million Muslims here, that tells us that we're at insurgency levels. Now, that means we have to adopt counterinsurgency measures, and the way that you can defeat an insurgency is by isolating the insurgents from the host community they seek to recruit from. And you'll be unable to do that if you cannot name the Islamist ideology and isolate it from mainstream Islam. So that was point number one. And then I said, of course, the government's counter-extremism policy, known as PREVENT, must be reinforced, it must be reinvigorated, and communities must be galvanised to get involved with countering extremism on a community-based level because the security services simply can't keep up. We need the communities involved. The third point I said was that it's been over a decade since the horrific 7/7 bombings in London. And yet, despite all this time having passed, the government still doesn't have a central counter-extremism coordinator pulling together government policy across all government departments. And finally, the fourth point is that no counter-extremism policy or strategy carries with it any moral weight unless it maintains its respect for our human rights principles. If the terrorists are attacking us because they hate our freedom and democracy, then why would we attack that very freedom and democracy ourselves by undermining our values and by abrogating our human rights commitments?
There's heated debate in this country about the circumstances around which an extremist group should or shouldn't be banned. Hizb ut-Tahrir is the one most commonly discussed. You were recruited by Hizb ut-Tahrir at the age of 16. What can you tell us about what they stand for, their strategy, how they operate, and in fact how dangerous they really are?
Hizb ut-Tahrir indeed did recruit me when I was 16. They are ideologically very dangerous. They were the first group, Islamist group, to popularise the notion that a caliphate, a theocratic Muslim state, needs to be resurrected, and it would be a pan-Islamist state. It would be global and it would be expansionist. Just imagine the Third Reich, but for Muslims. This is what Hizb ut-Tahrir advocates, a expansionist theocratic caliphate state. They believe in a notion they call offensive jihad, which means preemptively declaring jihad against foreign states. They believe that the entire world must come under the dominion of their theocracy, of their so-called caliphate. And they play language games. They don't call it a theocracy. They insist, in fact, it's not a theocracy, it's the caliphate. But, you know, enforcing a version of Sharia over society is theocracy. Otherwise, what is a theocracy if that's not? So they are incredibly ideologically dangerous because that notion of a caliphate has spread from them to Al-Qaeda and, in turn, to ISIS. They are, however, not a terrorist organisation. And so this is where the conversation comes around banning them or not to ban them. Do we ban extremist organisations that we don't like? I've arrived at the conclusion, I give this advice and I gave it to the UK government, I give it to governments wherever I'm asked, that we must distinguish between where Hizb ut-Tahrir is seeking to come to power directly, physically come to power, because their means to come to power, though it's not through the use of terrorism, it is through the use of inciting military coups against dictatorships or democracies. And so countries like Turkey, Pakistan, that have elected, albeit imperfect, governments, Hizb ut-Tahrir will still seek to overthrow those governments and the state there through military coups. So there it makes sense for the group to be banned. But in Western countries where it operates separately to its branches in Pakistan and Turkey, and where it doesn't seek to overthrow the state through military coups, instead it seeks simply to preach its extremist ideology, the line must be drawn. And I think that instead of banning them outright because they're not a terrorist group, we must make their activities difficult. We must challenge them in civil society, and they need to be turned into a taboo, a bit like homophobia and racism are taboo.
One of your four-point plan suggestions for tackling violent extremism is to convince ideologues to embrace secularism and adopt liberal democratic values, as you suggested. The Australian government agrees and has proposed the way to do that is to toughen citizenship laws by, among other things, requiring university-level English skills and the introduction of an Australian values test. What's your view on the validity of such an approach?
When it comes to citizenship tests and Australian value tests, we have them here for new citizens and often born and raised citizens who have no cultural heritage from another country. So, you know, the white English born and raised citizen often would also fail these tests. The thing with tests is they can become academic exercises and people can learn by rote. Instead, I'd like to focus on values. I think secular, small L liberal, as in the, you know, the freedoms and the individual autonomy and the values that respect those sorts of rights, democratic, pluralistic, human rights grounded values that are the foundations of our social contract in Western societies. Those values should be reinforced through debate, discussion and critical thinking. And then when you look at it in that way, it makes it impossible for us not to approach this through a civil society perspective. I think that all Australians need to be involved in reasserting those secular democratic values and in challenging Islamist extremism. I often say you don't need to be black to challenge racism, you don't need to be gay to challenge homophobia, and you don't need to be Muslim to challenge Islamist theocracy, though Muslims also must step up to that challenge, and not enough is being done currently. And they must join with everybody else in challenging all evils in society, whether it's anti-Muslim bigotry, racism, or indeed Islamist extremism.
And finally, a question on the UK election. Theresa May has struck this alliance with Northern Ireland's DUP. This is Britain's most socially conservative political party. I'm curious to know what you think, whether this sort of loose coalition really is likely to be as benign as analysts and vested interests in the Parliament would have us believe.
The UK media and the world's media has focused on the, let's call them regressive social values of the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP. They want to restrict abortion rights. They don't believe in gay marriage equality. They are creationists, in a sense, denying evolution occurred. They have very strange beliefs and values that are lifted literally and vacuously from the Old Testament often. And so, yes, the media has rightly focused on that as a problem, but actually a bigger problem is lurking behind that. There's a bigger danger than the regressive social values that are objectionable, and that is the impact on the Northern Ireland peace process. The Good Friday Agreement stipulated that power sharing in the Stormont Assembly in Northern Ireland must occur between the nationalists in the form of Sinn Féin and the unionists in the form of the DUP. These two parties are obliged by the Good Friday terms to share power in the Stormont Assembly. Now, the Stormont Assembly has been entirely vacant for 3 months. There is no Northern Ireland First Minister. There is no Deputy Minister. There are no minister positions being filled at all. They have all been vacant for 3 months. And the reason is because the DUP and Arlene Foster, its leader, were involved in a huge cash for ash scandal. It was called the Cash for Ash scandal. And it was corruption and sleaze at the highest level in politics. Sinn Féin resigned from the Stormont Assembly in protest at that financial scandal, and they demanded the resignation of Arlene Foster as the leader of the DUP. And that standoff had been going on for 3 months. Of course, the terms of the Good Friday Agreement say that if a power-sharing arrangement cannot be met by a certain deadline, direct rule must be resumed from Westminster. And there's the danger. The danger is that if the Sinn Féin and DUP cannot come to terms and power-sharing arrangements in Stormont, Westminster is obliged under Good Friday to directly come back and take charge of affairs in Northern Ireland. And so the Conservative Party's alliance with the DUP makes it less likely for Sinn Féin to come to terms with the DUP over this financial corruption scandal, because it puts the British government in a non-neutral position vis-à-vis these two parties. And the Good Friday Agreement stipulated that the British government and the Republic of Ireland need to be neutral. So if Theresa May's Conservative Party work with the DUP, it makes it incredibly unlikely for Sinn Féin to see them as neutral, which will mean the breakdown of the Stormont power-sharing arrangements, which will mean a direct rule from Westminster. And, of course, the danger there is a return to the troubles and the violence in Northern Ireland if the Good Friday peace arrangement breaks down. And a breakdown of the peace is a far worse problem than the socially regressive values that the DUP hold on to. So it's not looking optimistic in any way in Northern Ireland. And I think Theresa May has brought stability at Westminster at the expense of instability in Northern Ireland. And it's incredibly cynical.
We have to leave it there, unfortunately. Maajid Nawaz, I thank you very much for your time.
A pleasure. Thank you. I'll see you again, hopefully.